if you put soldiers into the field, no matter how well controlled and how heavily indoctrinated they are, you're going to have losses. You're going to have people being captured. And yes, on one level, it may be considered sort of marginally embarrassing, but frankly, embarrassing more for Pyongyang, I would suggest, rather than Moscow, particularly because, look, these are just ordinary soldiers. It's not as if they're going to have any great insight into sort of grand plans or the like. I think it's more that just simply one can understand why the Ukrainians want to make a big deal of this, because they really want to emphasize this point of the fact of the struggle against Russia is not just about Russia. It's about this whole axis of whatever, axis of bad people. There's been so many different sort of formulations created, and particularly on the eve of the Trump inauguration, they're trying to give reasons why America should care about the Russo-Ukrainian war.
And Russian troops were reportedly under orders to kill injured DPRK soldiers to prevent their capture going public in Russia. But at the same time, Putin openly boasts of his alliance with Kim Jong-un. Why? Where's the link between these two? Why is he so keen to hide the fact that there are soldiers from North Korea fighting for Russia?
To be perfectly honest, I'm not actually convinced about some of the claims about Russians being told to kill wounded North Koreans, burning their faces off, and such like. Look, it's clear that there's been a certain amount of military tradecraft, issuing them with fake Russian uniforms and ammunition, and identity papers, and so forth. But more broadly, rumours, the more lurid, the better, will inevitably abound in this conflict. The fact of the matter is, exactly, Russia is making no bones about the fact that there are Korean troops. If you look at the Russian media, for example, they refer directly to this. And so, although I think probably the orders that Pyongyang has given its troops is death before dishonor, and we have had cases precisely of North Koreans killing themselves rather than letting themselves be captured. Maybe it's because of ideology. Maybe it's because they're worried about what might happen to their families back home. I mean, this is let's face it, the North Korean regime makes Putin's look positively humane. So, I mean, in that context, there's all sorts of reasons why we haven't had many captives, but I don't think it's because Russians have been gunning them down.
And what does the use of DPRK troops tell us about Putin's casualty problem? I mean, we know that it's not just soldiers from North Korea that have been brought in by Russia to join the fight.
Well, the interesting thing about the presence of North Koreans is actually the initiative seems to have come from Pyongyang. It's not that Putin was desperate for them. It's actually that Kim Jong-un offered them. I mean, not for free. I mean, these are in some ways to be considered state mercenaries. I mean, they're not pocketing much, but obviously Pyongyang is benefiting from that. There's a lot of overblown talk about this shows desperation and so forth on Putin's part. Well, I mean, it doesn't, any more than the fact that the Ukrainians are relying on ammunition and kit from elsewhere. It's more that absolutely, at present, for political reasons, Putin, the one thing he really wants to do is to avoid mobilizing or having to send conscripts, 18, 19-year-olds into battle. So on the whole, he's still relying on volunteers attracted by pretty massive salaries and bonus payments. But on the other hand, absolutely, if he can recruit North Koreans or impoverish people from the global south, as has been happening, to help just simply meet up a little bit of the shortfall of manpower, why wouldn't he do that? It is ruthless, but in its own way, it is common sense.
And do we know much about what it is that North Korea are getting in return for these troops?
Well, we know it's things like fuel oils and wheat. After all, this is a country that seems to have sort of endemic problems with starvation and malnutrition, even amongst its soldiers, to be honest. Beyond that, it's clear that technology is part of the deal. And this is obviously where it's of much wider concern because of North Korea's continuing nuclear program. So far, it does not look as if the Russians are actually providing direct input into, for example, nuclear actual devices. Not least because that's something that probably Beijing would be very leery about. But on the other hand, the rocketry, actually the systems which would launch the nuclear devices, that is precisely one of the areas in which the Russians are providing assistance, especially because a lot of this is dual use. North Korea also wants to actually have a space program. It's tried launching satellites and so forth. And so the technologies that are useful for the space program, there is a clear overlap with those that are also useful for nuclear missiles. So that is the kind of area that definitely the Russians are providing.
And you mentioned China there. Is the relationship between North Korea and Russia going to be an issue for China? And more widely, are they going to be putting pressure on Putin to come to some sort of resolution or ceasefire in Ukraine this year?
I think at the moment, the Chinese perspective on the war as a whole seems to be they clearly don't want Putin to lose, but on the other hand, they don't necessarily care whether he wins or not. From their point of view, this war, however horrific it is, absolutely, nonetheless, it is quite useful. It is a massive distraction for the West. It is forcing them to spend assets on resources that are not necessarily geared for a potential conflict in and around Taiwan. It continues to open something of a wedge between the West and the global South. And this is allowing the Chinese to present themselves as the new reasonable global power. Look at the Russians, look at the Westerners involved in this sort of bitter dispute. They don't really care about you. We would love to actually see a new global order that isn't dominated by this kind of petty spats. There's all sorts of opportunities for Chinese sanctimoniousness to come out through their diplomacy, and it's working to a degree. So I think that, plus the fact that it actually means that Russia is spiraling closer and closer to vassal statehood, dependent as it is on Chinese banks, on Chinese dual-use technologies and such like. All of this means it's actually turned into quite a good war for Beijing. But on the specific point of the interactions, this sort of triangular relationship between Moscow, Pyongyang, and Beijing. Look, I don't think that this relationship between the Russians and the North Koreans would be developing if Beijing was at all unhappy with it. Both of them really need Beijing's approval a hell of a lot more than they need what the other can provide. And so in the future, this is something to watch, that precisely if, for example, this relationship gets a little bit too close for Beijing's comfort. But at present, look, if in some ways Moscow can take the pressure off North Korea, that's fine. Because the big nightmare that Beijing has is a total systemic collapse in North Korea and millions of refugees pouring across the border. So actually, if thanks to this war, Russia is helping feed North Korea, that's no bad thing.
And back in Europe, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk has warned that Russia is planning acts of terror in his country and elsewhere. Are acts of Russian sabotage, though, likely to stop or slow if there is some sort of ceasefire in Ukraine?
I think we might see some slight sort of turning down of the dial. But look, we have to bear in mind that as far as Putin is concerned, he is in effect at war with the West. And what's happening in Ukraine is merely just a manifestation of that. He doesn't give the Ukrainians credit for being a truly sovereign nation. He regards them essentially as proxies of the West. I mean, it's very striking that, for example, recent operations in the Black Sea area, they very clearly said, well, it's all Britain's fault because Britain is the one that is essentially running Ukrainian operations in the Black Sea. So I think in that context, this campaign we've seen that's ranging from disinformation and cyber attack all the way through to arson, sabotage, and assassination, is, as far as the Russians are concerned, a way of trying to make Europe pay for its continued support for Ukraine, make Europeans feel that they have skin in the game and that this war really is affecting their lives. So if there is a ceasefire, we might see him being cautious enough to sort of scale down some of the more extreme examples, again, the sort of arson and assassination type things. But essentially, I think the sad truth of the matter is that so long as Putin is in the Kremlin, we are going to have to accept that the new normal is a continued low-level, covert, deniable campaign of attempts by the Russians to destabilize us, to exaggerate and exacerbate divisions within and between countries, and yes, from time to time, killing people that the Kremlin finds particularly annoying.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.